The winter sun was a pale thing that morning, stretched thin over the jagged ridges. Its light filtered through the steam of the sawmills and the haze of breath in the cold air. In the timber yard, a man worked alone, his axe rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed older than the trees themselves. He was a large man, built by labor, shoulders bowed slightly from years of carrying logs. His breath, a soft plume in the frost. The sound of his work was steady, steel biting into pine, the crack and sigh of wood giving way, the thud as it hit the frozen ground. No one bothered him. No one ever did. He spoke little, kept his eyes down, and when he was done for the day, he carried his quiet with him back to the small cabin at the edge of the forest. There, he ate simple meals by the light of an oil lamp, the walls holding only the faint scent of wood smoke and solitude. Nights in the mountains had a particular cold to them, the kind that sank into the bones and stayed there. He bore it without complaint, as he bore everything. That day, word reached him in a strange way, half overheard between the thud of boots on wooden planks, half caught in the idle talk of men gathered outside the saloon. There was to be a peculiar sale in town. A woman, they said, a grown one at that, to be sold like a mule or a patch of land, all to settle some debt. The story was already swollen with rumor. Some claimed she was ugly beyond imagining. Others said she'd gone mad and would bite a man's hand clean off. A few swore she was cursed, and that her face, hidden beneath a sack, would bring bad luck to any who looked upon it. He listened without letting on, though in truth, such talk stirred a low unease in him. In a place like this, people didn't bother to hide their cruelty. They liked to dress it in laughter, but it was cruelty all the same. By the time he reached the edge of the crowd, the wooden platform was already set. The auctioneer, a thin man with a booming voice, stood to one side. And there she was, still, silent, wrapped in a worn dress, boots caked with old mud, her hands loosely bound in front of her. The sack covered her head completely, tied at the neck, shapeless and strange, as though she had been erased from the world except for the outline of her body. She did not fidget, did not glance toward the men who leered or laughed. She stood as if she had been standing there her whole life. The bidding began with a false brightness, the auctioneer tossing numbers into the air like dice. $20, 15, 10. His voice carried across the boards, but it was met with shrugs, mutters, and the occasional jeer. A man near the back called out something that made the others laugh, a sound sharp as splintered glass. The numbers dropped lower. 5. Still no takers. The auctioneer's smile grew tighter. Somewhere deep in the crowd, the lumberjack felt something shift, not in his thoughts, exactly, but in the quiet place where his thoughts came from. Perhaps it was the way she stood there, without resistance or plea. Perhaps it was the weight in the air, heavy with the kind of loneliness he knew too well. Before he could reason it out, his hand was in the air. $2, he said, his voice cutting through the restless murmur. The coins in his palm felt cold as he stepped forward, and when they hit the table, the sound rang louder than the laughter, louder than the auctioneer's voice declaring the deal done. The crowd's interest faded almost immediately. They turned back to their drinks and talk as if nothing of importance had happened. She stepped down from the platform without hesitation, her bound hands still before her. He didn't speak, only reached to untie them. The rope slid away, leaving faint marks on her wrists. For a moment, she stood beside him, not looking up. Then they began the walk toward the edge of town. The snow started as a fine dust, drifting in from the mountains, settling on her shoulders and his. The road was quiet except for their steps, boots crunching in the frost. He did not ask where she had come from. She did not offer. Halfway to the cabin, her voice came low and muffled through the sack, saying only that she could cook, she could clean, and she would work if he let her stay. He gave a short nod, the kind that meant more than words in his world. The cabin welcomed them with a faint smell of pine sap and the ghost of the morning's fire. He set another log on the flames, the light flickering across the rough-hewn walls. She stood near the door, uncertain, until he gestured to the table. He took off his coat, heavy with the day's cold, and held it out. She hesitated before taking it, pulling it close around herself. Her hands were thin but strong, the nails worn. He busied himself with the stew he'd started before leaving, the thick broth bubbling in the pot, steam rising in soft curls. They ate without talk. The wind scratched at the windows, but inside was stillness. Every so often he glanced toward her, the sack still in place, and wondered what lay beneath it, not just the face, but the life that had brought her here. She kept her head down, spoon steady in her hand. When she set the empty bowl aside, her fingers brushed the wood of the table as though grounding herself, as though making sure it was real. Later, when the fire burned low, he found an extra quilt for her and set it on the small bed in the corner. She murmured a thank you, almost lost in the creak of the cabin settling. He did not answer, but when he went to his own bed, he left the door to his small room open, a silent offering of safety. The night grew deep around them, and in that little cabin, two lives, both roughened by silence, began, without ceremony, to bend toward each other. Outside, the snow fell heavier, covering the road that had brought her here. Inside, the last thing he saw before sleep was the faint curl of steam still drifting from the pot on the table, the sack on her head casting a shadow across her shoulders, her hands folded in her lap, still as a photograph not yet taken. The storm had been building since afternoon, and by nightfall it was a living thing pressing against the cabin walls. The wind moaned through the pines, rattled the shutters, sent loose snow swirling into ghostly shapes outside the window. Inside, the oil lamp burned low, its light spilling gold across the table, where she sat peeling potatoes. The sack was still over her head, tied loosely now, but never far from her skin. Her hands moved with quiet purpose, the knife glinting with each turn. He sat across from her, mending a leather strap, the fire murmuring between them. Words were few, but the room felt fuller than it had in years. By day, life settled into a rhythm so natural it might have been written long before they met. She cleaned the cabin, scrubbing the floors until the wood showed its grain again. She mended his shirts, her stitching fine and tight. Meals were warm and ready when he returned from a forest, his shoulders powdered with sawdust and snow. He never asked her to do these things, just as she never asked why he spent such long hours among the pines. It was an unspoken exchange, her tending to the home, his tending to the work that kept it. Their conversations were brief, but each word seemed to carry more weight than idle talk ever could. The first time he took her into town for supplies, the old shopkeeper paused mid-measure of flour to look at her. His eyes lingered, sharp with curiosity, but he said nothing. He filled the sack with sugar, coffee, and a coil of rope while the lumberjack counted coins on the counter. When the woman reached for the bag, the shopkeeper's gaze caught hers, or would have, if not for the sack's rough cloth between them. Still, he seemed to study the outline of her face, as if he were trying to draw it from memory. Not everyone kept their thoughts to themselves. On the walk back, a neighbor passed them on horseback, his eyes narrowing before his mouth curled into something ugly. He tossed a remark over his shoulder, something about a man paying for what he couldn't earn otherwise. The lumberjack didn't break stride. He didn't raise his voice. He only turned his head enough to meet the man's eyes with a look that carried more weight than any curse. The neighbor's grin faltered, and he spurred his horse away. The woman said nothing, but later that night, when she set his plate on the table, she placed a second slice of bread beside it, thicker than usual. It didn't escape him that she startled at sudden sounds, the crack of a branch outside, the clang of a dropped pot. Once, when he returned early and pushed the cabin door open without warning, she froze as if bracing for something unseen. His eyes followed the shape of her wrists, the faint pale scars there, but he never asked. Questions could be knives, and he had no wish to cut her. One evening, with the wind low and the fire breathing soft heat into the room, he spoke her name. Not because he knew it, but because he wanted to. He asked it quietly, almost as if asking might scare it away. She stilled, hands folded in her lap. Beneath the sack, her breath was steady, but gave no answer. He didn't repeat the question. Days passed. They worked, they ate, they shared the same slow, wordless hours. And then, one night, when the darkness outside seemed endless and the cabin's warmth a small, precious island, she whispered it into the air between them. The syllables were soft, almost shy, but carried something that caught in his chest. He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable shifting in his eyes, then nodded and turned back to the fire. He didn't speak the name aloud again that night, but he carried it like a hidden ember. In the days that followed, their movements began to weave together without thought. He built her a narrow shelf beside the bed for her few belongings, a folded shawl, a comb, a small wooden box she kept closed. She baked bread in the mornings, leaving a piece by the workbench when he was out cutting timber. He began stacking extra firewood near the door so she wouldn't have to fetch it herself. They passed in and out of each other's space, as if they'd been doing so for years, the air between them warm in ways they never named. But quiet doesn't keep the world away. One afternoon, when he'd gone to fetch nails from the shop, a rider came into town. He was a broad man, carrying himself like someone used to getting answers. He leaned on the counter, speaking low to the shopkeeper, who glanced once toward the door before shaking his head. Haven't seen her, he lied easily, slipping the nails into a paper sack. The rider's eyes narrowed, but he didn't press. When the lumberjack left, he caught the shopkeeper's gaze for a moment, a silent understanding passing between them. The woman didn't know any of this yet. She was at the cabin, humming faintly as she stirred a pot of stew, the storm still whispering against the windows. The oil lamp swayed slightly in the draft, casting shadows that stretched and breathed along the walls. Somewhere in those shadows, without either of them saying so, trust had begun to grow. It wasn't loud or sudden, but like roots pushing through frozen ground, slow and certain, finding their way toward the light. The snow had begun to melt in the open spaces, leaving the earth damp and smelling faintly of pine and thaw. In the clearing behind the cabin, sunlight drifted down through the tall pines in narrow, bright columns. She stood among them, hanging wet laundry on the line, her sleeves rolled to the elbow. The breeze caught the shirts and sheets, making them billow and swell like sails searching for a wind to carry them somewhere far. For the first time since she had arrived, the sack was not on her head. Her hair, dark and uneven from a rough cutting long ago, shifted with the wind. Her face was tired, marked with faint lines at the corners of her eyes, the quiet proof of storms weathered and survived. She did not hide from the sun. She let it find her. And later, when he stepped outside with an armful of split logs and heard the low sound of her laughter, short, uncertain, but real, something in his chest eased, as if he'd been holding his breath for months without knowing it. In the weeks that followed, her story began to slip into the air between them in fragments. It came without plan, a sentence here, a memory there, stitched into the quiet hours of shared work. She spoke of a man who had claimed to own her, who'd taken her not for love, but as payment against a debt that was never truly hers. She spoke of the work he made her do, the cold she slept in, the way she learned to keep her head down and her mouth closed. The sack, she said, was his idea, sometimes to humiliate her, sometimes to hide what he had marked as his. She did not tell it all, and he did not press for more. The weight of her words was enough to understand the shape of her past. Their days took on a new kind of rhythm. In the early mornings, before the frost had burned off the grass, they sat on the porch with tin cups of coffee warming their hands. The steam curled into the cold air, carrying the scent of beans and wood smoke. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. He began teaching her to use an axe, her grip awkward at first, the blade biting into the wood at strange angles. She kept trying, jaw set, shoulders tight with determination. He showed her how to let the weight of the tool do the work, how to breathe with the swing. In return, she mended the tear in his work coat, the stitches neat and even. When she handed it back, he wore it without a word, but kept his hand on the collar for a moment longer than usual. The piece was not meant to last. One afternoon, as he was loading timber into the sled at the edge of town, the rider appeared again. The same man the shopkeeper had warned away, broad-shouldered and carrying himself with the arrogance of someone who believed the land, and the people on it, were his for the taking. His eyes narrowed when they met. He didn't waste time. He said her name as if it were still his to use, his voice rough with claim. Said she was bound to him, no matter where she'd run, that she owed him more than she could ever repay. The lumberjack stood still, the sled rope in his hand, his voice low but unyielding when he told the man to turn around. There was no anger in it, no show of strength, just a plain refusal that left no room for argument. The rider's mouth twisted into something like a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He said he'd be back, and next time he wouldn't be alone. Then he rode off, the sound of his horse fading into the trees. When the lumberjack returned to the cabin, she was by the stove, stirring a pot. He didn't tell her right away. He didn't want the fear in her eyes, if he could help it. But fear has a way of finding its way in without being named. Later that night, she stood in the small corner where her shelf sat and began folding the shawl, the comb, the wooden box into a bundle. She meant to leave before the trouble came. He found her like that, her hands working quickly, the firelight making shadows of her movements. She started to speak, about not wanting him hurt, about the danger following her. But he stepped into the doorway and said only one word. Stay. It was not a plea. It was a steady anchor dropped into the rushing water of her thoughts. For a moment, she stood frozen, the bundle in her hands. Then her fingers loosened, and the cloth fell back onto the shelf. She sat down at the table, her head bowed, and the tears came, silent at first, then breaking into small shudders. They fell onto the grain of the wood, darkening it in uneven shapes. His hand, rough from years of work, rested over hers. He did not try to stop the tears, did not tell her it would all be all right. He simply stayed there, the warmth of his hand holding her in place while the storm she carried inside ran its course. Outside, the wind had stilled, but inside, the air felt heavy with the weight of the past pressing close. And still, between them, there was a space that the past could not touch. The night was still except for the restless wind threading through the pines. The moon hung low and silver, brushing the clearing in front of the cabin with a pale glow. Somewhere far off, a lone wolf called into the darkness, the sound drawn out and aching. Smoke drifted faintly on the air, not the sharp scent of fire close at hand, but a whisper of something that would soon come. Inside, the lumberjack sat by the fire, sharpening the edge of his axe in slow, deliberate strokes. He knew, before he heard the hooves, that trouble was on its way. They came just past midnight, 3 riders, their silhouettes cutting against the tree-line as they emerged into the open. The leader rode in front, the same man who had once claimed her as his due. 2 others flanked him, their faces shadowed under the brims of their hats, their shoulders hunched with a kind of purpose that makes a man dangerous. They didn't speak as they dismounted, the snow crunching beneath their boots. The horses snorted, restless in the cold. The lumberjack stepped outside, the axe still in his hand, its blade glinting like ice under the moonlight. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply stood there in the doorway, his frame broad and still, like a tree too old and rooted to be moved by any storm. The men stopped a few paces from him, their breath clouding in the air. The leader's eyes narrowed, searching for weakness, for some sign of hesitation, but found none. The air between them was heavy, brittle as frozen glass. Then she stepped out. No sack over her shoulders this time, no weight hunching her back. Her hair was loose, black strands flying in the wind like a banner. The cold bit at her cheeks, but her eyes were steady, bright with something neither of the men had seen in her before. She stood beside the lumberjack without touching him, the space between them charged with quiet understanding. And then she spoke, her name, clear and sure, her voice carried in the stillness like a bell over an empty valley. It was the first time she had said it aloud in their presence, not the name they had given her, not the name used to bind her, but her own name, the one she had carried since before shame and hardship had tried to take it away. The words cut through the air sharper than any weapon, and for a moment, no one moved. Something changed then. The leader shifted his weight, glancing toward the trees as though the shadows there suddenly seemed deeper. The other 2 men looked at him, uncertain now. The lumberjack hadn't moved a muscle, but the quiet power in his stance, combined with the fire in her voice, seemed to strip the fight from them. They weren't beaten, not in the way a man is beaten by fists or blood, But in a deeper way, the way a man is beaten when he realizes the person he came to drag back will never follow him again. Without another word, they stepped back. The leader's face was unreadable, but there was something like a warning in his eyes as he turned and walked toward his horse. The others followed, boots crunching in the snow, tack jingling softly as they mounted. And then they were gone, swallowed by the black tangle of trees, their hoofbeats fading into the wind until there was only the whisper of the pines again. She didn't speak. Not yet. The lumberjack stepped aside, letting her go in first, the door closing softly behind them. She crossed the corner where the sack lay, the one she had carried like a weight for so long, the sack that held the last physical piece of her shame, the burden she had thought she'd never be free from. She picked it up slowly, feeling the coarse fabric in her hands. For a moment she just stood there, holding it, her fingers tightening on the edge. Then she walked to the hearth. The fire glowed low, embers shifting and breathing in the grate. She didn't look back at him. She set the sack down, pulled it open, and one by one emptied its contents into the flames. The cloth curled, blackened, and shrank under the heat. The smell rose sharp and bitter. She added the sack itself last, pushing it deep into the coals until it caught. The flames licked up greedily, and the fabric twisted in on itself, turning to nothing but ash. The lumberjack said nothing. He leaned on the handle of his axe, his face unreadable except for the faint warmth in his eyes. He knew this was her doing, her choice, not something she was doing for him or anyone else. She stood there until the last scrap was gone, until there was nothing left to burn. Only then did she turn, meeting his gaze, and in the quiet between them there was an understanding too solid for words. The days that followed were quiet. The snow deepened. The forest went on with its business, crows calling in the mornings, the sound of logs splitting clean under the lumberjack's axe, the smell of coffee on the stove. When she spoke now, her voice carried a steadiness it hadn't before. She no longer avoided the small mirror on the wall. She walked into town with her head high. It was in town, in that quiet corner by the mercantile, that it happened. No dresses, no flowers, no gathering of strangers to watch. Just the shopkeeper and an old neighbor standing by, serving as witnesses. He stood beside her, large hands folded in front of him, his eyes steady on hers. The words were spoken simply, the vows plain, the moment without pomp or performance. This was not for show. It was for truth. When it was done, he didn't kiss her like a man claiming something. He just took her hand, and they walked out together into the cold. Life went on. There was wood to cut, bread to bake, storms to ride out. But something had shifted in the air between them. Not the thunder and lightning that some people spoke of when they told their stories of love, but something quieter, steadier. A presence that didn't have to announce itself to be real. And maybe that was the truth of it. Love doesn't always come roaring in like a storm, tearing down walls and leaving a man breathless. Sometimes it walks in softly, buys your freedom for $2, and waits patiently until you are ready to stand in the cold night air, speak your own name, and claim yourself. And when you do, it's there beside you, not to lead, not to follow, but to stand steady in the place you choose to call home.